All right, welcome back to New Testament Survey as we continue our study of the first century historical background. Just have a couple more things some loose ends I want to tie up in this video. One of the things I want to talk about is the people of the New Testament world, and three major groups that we'll talk about throughout our class time together. First of all, we want to talk about the Jews themselves. The Jews were deeply monotheistic at this point. All during the Old Testament, they had fallen to false gods and fallen down and worshipped false gods. But by this point, the exile, the 70 years of exile, had completely galvanized the Jewish people to be severely monotheistic, even to the point that when Jesus Christ begins to refer to himself as the Son of God, the Jewish people had a hard time accepting that because they were going to be monotheistic even to a fault, even to the fault of rejecting the true Messiah, because no, we serve just one God. And so the idea of a Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was completely offensive to them. The fact that God could be made flesh was offensive to them. So deeply religious, although there are several different sects within Judaism, many of them were highly anticipated the Messianic kingdom. There was a tremendous amount of anticipation, looking forward to when the Messiah would come. So it dominated a lot of conversations. Many of them saw the Messiah coming as a military ruler, a king who would overthrow Rome or cast off Rome and bring Israel into another, like a Solomonic kind of a kingdom again. The second group we want to talk about are the Greeks. When we talk about the Greeks, many times, according to the Romans, Greeks were non-Jew, according to the Jews, Greeks were pretty much anyone who were non-Jews. So we talk about in Romans, we say the gospel to the Jew first, and also to the Greeks. Sometimes that's referred to any non-Jew. But the Greeks themselves talk about their language, the Greek language. We talk about them being very philosophical people, very interested in education, deeply interested in intellectual arguments, and so we'll see them. We talk about the Greeks when we talk about the book of Luke and the book of Acts. We'll see that they're written to a Greek audience. And we'll encounter them several times in the New Testament. Then we talk about the Romans themselves. The Romans were very much interested in power, in political power, and how to gain political power. The Romans thought very highly of themselves. They're very proud people, but they're also people of action, and they're people that want to just simply get things done. And if that means that I need to kill or to be killed in order to get that done, then so be it. But they're also deeply interested in honor. We see that several times throughout the New Testament, where a Roman soldier is more interested in honoring his family and honoring Rome and Caesar than he is even in keeping his own life. All right. As we continue on, I want to talk about the languages of the New Testament. First, let's talk about Greek, which is the primary language of the New Testament. The entire New Testament is written in Greek. And here's an example for you. This is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Of course, you know the the word here. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you can see that word. Maybe you can even kind of make it out there. The word logos, the word for the Word, who is Jesus Christ Himself. The Greek is what's called Common Greek, or sometimes called Koine Greek. For the longest time, there was only one form of Greek that was known to scholars, and that was classical Greek. And because the New Testament wasn't written in classical Greek, it's a very different kind or different style of Greek than classical Greek that, say, Plato or Aristotle or Socrates would have written in. And Homer and the Iliad, the Odyssey, those types of things were written in classical Greek, written before the New Testament. The New Testament had a different style of Greek. And for the longest time, it was actually thought of as, well, this is kind of the Holy Spirit's Greek. And it's a holy Greek. But what was found in sometime around the 1800s, there was a discovery that was found in which they dug up, actually, it was in Egypt, they dug up a dump, a city dump, and they found all of these papers, all of these papyruses, and all of these just little fragments of papers that were written by common people for common things, little receipts or little, whatever you would think to find in your trash or your garbage, letters written to individuals from one person to another. And what they found was this was the common Greek of the day. And so it's called Koine, or common Greek. And so we can see that the Bible was written for the common person. It was not written in a classical or high Greek, but rather written in common Greek. The Greek language is actually a very precise language. It's one of those kinds of languages that is so precise in its meaning that that just the way that words are spelled and the way that words are arranged, things can only mean one thing, which is why the New Testament has such precision, and why there's so many arguments as to how this should be interpreted or how this should be translated, particularly when it comes to the New Testament, because Greek can be such a very precise language. Then we have the book, the other languages of that time were Hebrew. I'm sorry, this is Aramaic. Let me get that correct here. Aramaic was spoken by the Jews in Galilee and the Jews throughout the Roman Empire, throughout Syria, throughout Judea as well. So the common Jew probably spoke Aramaic. This is a language that Jesus and the disciples all spoke. There's several passages of the Old Testament that are written in Aramaic, a large portion of the book of Daniel, several verses in Ezra and Second Chronicles are written in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic, if you look at this, you'd say, well, that looks a whole lot like Hebrew, which we'll see in a second. It's written in from right to left, just like Hebrew is. It has the same letters, it has the same grammar, but the vocabulary is considerably different. And you can see those Aramaic words used in the New Testament, mostly in the Gospels, when Jesus is speaking, when he speaks from the cross, when he speaks to the little girl. Many times he's using words in Aramaic. Then you have Hebrew. Again, looks very similar. Vocabulary is different, but Hebrew is a very common language. But by the time of the New Testament, classical Hebrew or Old Testament Hebrew was only spoken by the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sanhedrin and the priests. Most of the common Israelites or common Jews spoke Aramaic. All right. Then you have the Roman language. Roman, which was Latin. Latin is a very nice language. It's although none of the New Testament is written in Latin, it was translated into Latin at about 400 A.D. But Latin was the language of the Roman government. It was the language of any kind of legal things that were happening, and it was considered the high language of Rome, which is why in the Gospel of John we see that the three languages that are used, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, were used on the sign above Jesus' head. Now, there are several other things that I want to talk about that touch on the development of the gospel throughout the New Testament. And I want to just touch on these couple of things before I I close out this video, first I want to talk about the Greek language, because the Greek language from the time of Alexander the Great in BC 330 became universal. It was a trade language that was used throughout the Roman Empire, and everyone was able to learn Greek, and everyone spoke Greek. But it was not necessarily people's heart language. It was a trade language. Many of us in America today don't quite understand the concept of a trade language, but throughout Europe and throughout the world, when people learn English, they're learning it as a trade language. And in many parts of the world, there are dialects that are spoken in their home, but there are that they learn a trade language in order to get along in the world. Greek was that trade language throughout the Roman world. The Old Testament was, at this time, before this, was translated into Greek, and there was a Greek Old Testament. So most of the New Testament references to the Old Testament were out of that Septuagint, which was translated in the Old Testament, and we'll talk about that, I think, next week. We'll talk a little bit more about the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated into Greek. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the synagogues that had popped up all throughout the Roman Empire. From the time of the exile on, most Jews did not return to Jerusalem during the return under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. Instead, they stayed throughout the world in what's called the dispersion, or the diaspora. And in those regions or in those cities or towns where they could gather 10 Jewish men together, they would form a synagogue, or a gathering place. That's what the word synagogue means, a place of gathering. And on every Sabbath, they would get together and learn from a rabbi or teacher. They would read from the Old Testament. That's where the collection of the scrolls would be, where they would translate they would copy the Old Testament, mostly the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets, and they would distribute those throughout the Roman Empire to the synagogues, and they would have what's called a scriptorium, where they would keep the copies of the Bible. People didn't have copies of their own, and so they would go to the scriptorium in the synagogues. And this became a really great way for the gospel to spread throughout the Roman Empire, because it gave a starting off point for the gospel in each city. Of course, most of those places, the gospel was rejected in the synagogue, but it gave rise to the ability to spread the gospel, because the Bible itself had already spread throughout the Roman Empire. Then we have a couple of things that the Romans established. One being the Peace of Rome, or the Pax Romana, which is the peace that Rome had throughout the Roman Empire. There were no wars going on during the New Testament. There were no wars going on as the gospel spread throughout the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire had squashed any kind of rebellion, and people lived in constant fear of the Roman Empire, and there was a status quo because of the Pax Romana, because of the Peace of Rome, which of course made it very easy for the gospel to spread throughout the Roman Empire. And finally, we have the marvelous road system that the Romans invented to move from one part of the Roman Empire to another. And of course, God used those roads for the Apostle Paul and the other apostles to travel on to bring the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. So that's what we have in the first century background. Next week, we'll look into the introduction of the New Testament itself, and the religious and philosophical period there of the New Testament.